Join me, Natasha Smith, and my guests for an exclusive 6-episode series of the Can You Just Sit With Me podcast. Each episode is filled with hard yet needed conversations about loss, grief, and suffering. Come and sit with us for hope and healing for your journey. Listen on Apple Podcasts or wherever you stream. If I was to ask the question, can you just sit with me? What are your first thoughts? What are the first thoughts that come to your mind?
First, I love the question. It is there's such kindness and freedom and permission to be where you are in it. And so it feels like a breath of fresh air. Yeah. And it makes me think of a children's book that I shared with my grandchildren actually this week. That I've read many times with others, but this hit different because it was grandkids sharing it for the first time. It's this book called The Rabbit Listened, which is this lovely story for kind of elementary, toddler to elementary age, where something bad happens. And all these quote unquote helpers come to encourage the child to be mad about it or mess up someone else's something that they love or talk or cry or yell. And that's not what the child needs. And so ultimately this rabbit comes and just sits with him and just quietly enters the room and opens up space for the child to feel what the child feels. And it's such a sweet, simple story. But it touches me. And it's a reminder too that, we're talking about grief. We're talking about the need to just sit with people in wherever they are and with all kinds of loss. And that includes the children among us. Like, the last few years have been a lot. And they've lived through every bit of it that we have without some of the maturity and resources that we have. So all that to say, those are some of the first things that come to mind.
Sometimes we need someone who will just sit with us as we sit with our emotions, our losses, our grief, not only as adults, but our children as well. I love how Terra includes children in this episode. So important to allow space for children to express their emotions, but to also teach them that emotions and grieving are okay. Keep listening.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I love that so much. For one, tell me the name of the book again.
Yeah, it's The Rabbit Listened.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. What a beautiful resource. Like, I'm going to definitely have to pick that up for my kids because as you mentioned, wow. Yeah. That really just threw me into deep thought a little bit because just our kids they don't have a lot of the tools that we have in processing. So yeah,
that's right.
We might come back to that because that is like, oof.
It's important. It's important.
It's so important. It's so important because I don't want them to be where I was with, just walking in grief and not knowing how to process it. Oh my goodness. Okay. So to go along with that question, can you tell us about a time when you wanted to ask someone, can you just sit with me?
I can think of so many. I know a little bit of your story enough to know that question comes from a deep place in you as well. I can think of so many, but the one that kind of stands out for me the most is a season where it was a series of losses. It wasn't just one thing that came in kind of quick succession. And what I found is we were surrounded by a loving community that showed up in so many ways. They were there with meals. They were there with practical help, which was needed and which was wonderful and which we were grateful for. And, just being sort of floored by loss,
Yeah.
The sort of story where we were hearing from people, oh, you're kind of going through a Job season. Your story reminds me of Job, which is, not something you really hope to hear about your life.
Right.
And so those that were able and willing to just be with us and not fast forward, not urging us to fast forward past the grief, not wanting to fix it, but just be with us. Those people, they did exist, and I'm grateful for it, but they were few and far between.
Yeah,
they really were.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So would love for you to kind of move into your personal story and your personal story of loss and how that informs your new book, Hopeful Lament.
Yeah, it is a friend who was helping me kind of think about some early drafts said, your life has written this book and now it's time to let your fingers type it.
Oh, that's good.
I wonder if you can identify with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow.
And so, I wrote what I wish I had had. I wanted to, to offer what I've learned the hard way to others. And so like I said, it was the series of losses that came in quick succession. The first was my daughter she'd graduated and gone away to college. Her first semester was near coming to a close, and she heard from an old boyfriend who was having some mental health struggles, and he threatened her with violence. And she was told by police not to go to any class or anywhere on campus without an escort for the rest of the semester. And so you can imagine how terrifying that was for a young girl. It's her first months away from home on her own, and terrifying, of course, for us as her parents. And then not a month after that, my husband's business was the victim of an extensive fraud that sort of started a domino effect that led to him and lots of other people losing their jobs, of being falsely accused of crime themselves, with their reputation kind of dragged through the mud. And this was kind of happening before and between and after this piece was, we were a part of this church that we'd helped start. And some of the leadership started, it was going wrong in some ways. It was becoming manipulative. There were threads of pressing people to work too hard until they burned out, some manipulation that was happening. And so we tried to shine a light on it and to invite us all to kind of course correct. And it was becoming clear that was not going to happen. And so it became necessary for us to step away from this community that we loved, that we still love, that we poured life and heart and soul into.
Yeah.
And then just as, so all those things happened, the dust was kind of beginning to settle. And then visiting family members, it was about this time of year, there was a drought just like we're experiencing right now. And one of them was a smoker, and a stray ash at the bottom of the hill. We lived at the edge of the hill country at that time, and so our house was kind of up. So by the time we discovered the fire, you hear those stories about all we could do was get out. Like that was our experience. We I had just stepped out of the shower. My hair was wet. My feet were bare. I had a bulldog under the crook of my arm, and we had to get to safety, and that's all there was time to do. And so our sense of safety, our sense of security, vocation, community, a sense of calling, just all of it was compromised. And for me, I felt abandoned by God. I felt set adrift, and didn't have the tools or a sense of permission to do exactly what we're talking about. This holy and necessary but hard work of lament.
Oh my goodness. I'm so sorry for all this succession of losses.
Thank you.
and just the enormity of it all. One thing that I thought about as you were mentioning each thing is that, and just correct me, but I believe that each one of those losses were non-death losses.
That's right.
And to
That's
me,
right.
I just immediately want to stop and highlight that, because they are as important to
Yeah.
grieve
Yes.
as a death, because it, in so many facets and senses, it is a death of relationship, a death, so can we
Yes.
just sit there for a minute and kind of talk through that?
Yeah.
Because I
Yeah.
want you to tell everyone, like, how
Mm-hmm.
were you feeling when these things were happen? Like, maybe some of the emotional things that you went through, because
Mm-hmm.
some, often our culture, we think of grieving, and it's like, oh, who died.
Yep. That's right.
That's the first thing that comes to mind. But oh my gosh, these
Mm-hmm.
losses, whew, let's
Yeah.
talk about them.
That's right. They matter, and then there are all kinds of losses that tend to be more hidden.
Yeah.
A house fire is,
Oh,
you know,
right.
it's out there.
Yeah.
It's evident. But there are losses like infertility, miscarriage,
Hmm.
that tend to be kind of not talked about but
Yes.
as openly. And is the death of a loved one a loss? Of course it is.
Yes.
And
Hmm.
it's often assumed that if it's not that, then it's not
Right.
that bad,
Yes,
and that's
absolutely.
not true.
It's not
It's
true.
not true.
Hmm.
All these kinds of grief are significant and impactful,
Yeah.
and they deserve our love and our energy and space, room to be what they
Yes.
are. Yeah.
Yes. Now, one thing I called when you were mentioning as well, especially dealing with the church,
Yes.
having not feeling you have permission to kind of
Yes.
grieve that.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I think that is sadly
Hmm.
all too common.
Yeah. Hmm.
There's a sense that if you're a person of faith, if you've been a church leader, as we were, then you'll be unflappable. You won't be
Yeah.
moved by loss. You won't be moved by suffering. And if you are, a step further, there's often an implicit or sometimes even explicit sense that, well, your faith must be immature,
Exactly. Yeah.
or it must be lacking, or God is punishing you, or some other way
Hmm.
of heaping blame
Right.
on top of other pain as well.
Yes. That's why
Mm-hmm.
I love these conversations that we don't hear much about.
Yes.
Just kind of bringing to light, bringing awareness to, no, grief is natural, is normal, and necessary.
Yes.
It's
That's right.
necessary, and it's not a sign of weakness. It's not a sign of weak faith. So many biblical examples when we read our Bible, when we study our Bible, we find this. So
Yes.
it's such a disconnect, especially, we can say, yeah, the world, our culture, we can
Mm-hmm.
understand they may not know.
Mm-hmm.
But for the Christian and the church,
Mm-hmm.
when we study and read our Bible, we find example after example of grief,
Yes.
loss, and biblical models of how it's handled, and the
That's right.
compassion and empathy and example we have of Jesus. So
Mm-hmm.
so that makes it that much harder, I know, for me, when I
Yes.
think of how grievers, and even those in the mental health space,
Yes.
are treated really
Mm-hmm.
by the church at times.
Yes. Yeah. That's right. That's right. It's you know like you, when I started looking for it, because I had to, right?
Yeah,
When
right?
I
Yeah.
started looking for examples of grieving well, it's incredible how many faithful lament practices are woven through the stories of the Bible, are woven through, our spiritual mothers and fathers and our histories.
Yeah.
And, they've been they've been kind of systematically marginalized or silenced over, and we are experiencing their lack right now. And your work and my work, and I know others are with us in it, it's an invitation to return, to not simply, to be people of faith, but to be people of whole faith. That's
Whole
not
faith. Oh,
yeah that's not, it's not just, where joy and peace and grounding. It's also, there's room for what happens when life is hard, because life is hard.
Exactly.
At times. That's not the only thing it is, thank God.
Right. Yeah.
But it is hard at times.
I love that. I love just the word. It's an invitation. I love that it's not just, it includes what life, the reality of this world that we live in, that we will face trouble. We have all these things, suffering, pain. And anyway, so I love this conversation. I believe it's going to really help so many. So I want to kind of get into lament.
Yeah.
And just help us to kind of understand like what it is and why is it so important.
Mm-hmm. I talk about lament as an antidote to despair and hopelessness. And I think that's so important, because I think oftentimes when people hear that word lament, it sounds like it will be, getting stuck in grief, and it couldn't be further from the truth, right? It is, it's freedom. Lament is freedom to express all kinds of pain related to all kinds of losses, and to invite the presence of God into those, to let it become kind of a prayer. It's a way to metabolize grief, so that we're not carrying it around. And again, it's very rarely a one and done kind of thing, because what I have learned, and what I imagine you have learned about grief, is that it's not a straight line oftentimes. It's something that kind of spirals and loops around, and has to be picked up and set down, picked up again, and taken deeper each time. And so it's a practice. It's a practice that we're invited to, and it's important to name that it's heavy. It's hard work. It's heavy lifting, and so it's important to honor that, and to go at a reasonable, peaceable, kind pace. So not rushing to just sort of get through it and get to the other side, which doesn't usually work anyway.
I love that so much. I know I have like one at the end of each chapter of my book, I have like a grief exercise, and one of them out of 13 chapters is lament. So I'm so super excited about your book. I can't wait to bundle all these books together, like for gifts and giveaways. And so I want to just dive a little bit deeper into maybe because like you said, you kind of dug into researching and looking through scripture with this. Give us maybe an example like you found in the Bible that you can just share today. I know it's more than one, but just something that that you really just grasped as you were grieving.
Yeah. So we're talking about Job, and again, there are so many other examples. I want to get to Job because I think there are some ways that we tend to misunderstand that story, and miss some key parts. But before I say that, can I just say as well, again, as we've said, it's woven through the story, the old and new, and beyond. But one place where lament is sort of hidden in plain sight is in the nativity story. It's God is coming to take on humanity and show us what it means to live with freedom and grace and truth. And in the story of Christ's birth, there is also loss and lament when Herod thinks he's going to squash out this upstart, to his mind, this upstart king who's going to come and take his throne. And he has all these male children murdered. And Matthew quotes Jeremiah, who's talking about another time of loss and lament, talking about mothers who have lost their children, and they're wailing and they're weeping aloud, refusing to be comforted. And so that reality of honoring suffering is there even in that story of Christ coming and being born. But going back to Job's story, I think this was certainly my misunderstanding of the story, coming to it before all of these experiences of loss. It was Job grieved. Job trusted God's sovereignty. Fast forward. Everything's okay again.
Yeah, that's true.
And there is chapter after chapter after chapter of wrestling with questions, of struggling to find answers, of debate, and even arguing about where does suffering come from, what happens when God feels absent, etc. And while it's accurate that God shows up at the end and challenges Job for sort of making statements that he doesn't understand as fully as maybe purports to. And then God turns to Job's friends who had been telling him, God's judging you. You don't have enough faith. It was your kids, and God says, all of that is wrong. You spoke about me what is not true. Job was telling the truth. And you need to ask Job to pray for you. And that is where they are actually set free, because they're able to admit sometimes bad things happen and we don't understand why.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
that's powerful.
And it's interesting. Scholars believe that Job was actually one of the first books of the Bible, the first, I should say, book of the Bible that was written down. And if that's true, and it seems that it is, then God's very first words to us were about the reality of suffering, its inscrutability, and how God seems absent at times. And permission to wonder about it and wrestle with those realities. That is really freeing to me.
Absolutely. This is so important. This conversation, I'm like, I wish I had a megaphone and can just shout this to the world, because there's so many people who are hurting.
Yes.
And they don't know, they don't know that they can lament. They don't know that they can express anything. And so it's super sad, because there can be a freedom in this practice. So I love that you've written this book for us.
Yeah. There is such freedom and such permission that God can handle our hard emotions, not just our happy and put together ones. And that God can handle it, and that God actually welcomes them. We need to know that, and we need to know that deep in our souls. And it is harmful and a great lack when we don't.
Right. Now, when would you say that you put these into practice? Was it something you kind of stumbled upon, or like as you were kind of searching, or just maybe kind of take us back to like one of the losses that you experienced when you kind of recognize like, okay, I'm lamenting, or I can use
Mhm.
this here. Like how did it kind of formulate in your mind or in your life, or kind of manifest itself?
Yeah, it was slowly. I'll
Yeah.
say that.
Hmm.
I didn't sort of,
Yeah.
come with this ready-made list of, oh, I'll do this now.
Hmm.
Um, for a whole host of reasons. I was discovering by hard and necessary work that I actually had permission to not just be happy and not just fix it and kind of move on, so to
Yeah.
speak. And that took some time for me, because I'm sure there are many reasons, but one of them is what I had been taught, through my life growing up in the church, is that this is, we're put together. We trust, God is sovereign.
Hmm.
God is good all the time,
Right.
and so again, it's not that there's not
Yeah.
some truth,
Yeah.
and so I had to find my way into permission, and then it was beginning to notice what others did with grief.
Hmm.
It
Yeah.
was beginning to notice what I intuitively connected with. So initially, I'm remembering after my daughter's threat and my husband's fraud, it was the Christmas season,
Mm.
and the most wonderful time of
Yeah,
the year,
right.
right?
It's yeah.
and and it was not for
Yeah.
me.
Mm.
I was hurting,
Mhm.
deeply. We all were. And I remember hearing a particular Christmas carol that was actually a lament.
Oh, wow.
um, and it came in a minor key. And the story, it was the story being told in the song had nothing to do with my
Mhm.
experience, but a Christmas song that was in a minor key, that was a lament. I listened to it over and
Mm.
over and over that season, and there was and again, that was probably one of the first steps in walking my way into permission. Like,
Mhm.
it's okay to say, this is not the most wonderful time of the year.
Right.
Things are not all glittery and wonderful.
Yeah.
There's pain here too.
Mhm.
And again, it's not the only thing that's there,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
there's pain here too. And so,
Yeah.
and then, as far as the practices that I engage in my own prayer life and that I offer to others, um, really something shifted as really in recent years, as we stepped into the pandemic. Racialized division was having
Yeah.
new light shed, sexual abuse and cover-ups. And so I started modifying things that I saw in scripture and elsewhere from history, things like tearing practices, things
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
uh, dropping grains of salt into water, representing tears, where
Mm.
real tears could be welcome, but
Yeah.
if they, things like writing and singing grief,
Mm.
um, breath prayers,
Mhm.
etc.
Mhm.
Started finding my way into those things.
Mm.
And what I noticed is that as I shared them with people, there was such a sense of relief.
Mm.
And before getting to the particular practices, when we would talk about an invitation or a freedom to lament, it would be, again, this relief. And also, how do you do that? What does
Yeah.
that mean?
Yeah.
Right? And so some practical things that honor whole selves as, spirit, as soul, but as embodied people, are I think are really vital. And again, that's what we see modeled.
Mm.
David and Tamar tearing, and
Mm.
Job as well,
Yeah.
tearing garments, smearing ash,
Mhm.
those kinds of things. They're physical things, that express a spiritual and a soul reality.
Yes. I love this so much. Um, and so your book again, Hopeful Lament, Tending Our Grief Through Spiritual Practices. Um, I want to kind of talk about this phrase, everything happens for a reason.
Mhm, mhm,
And
mhm.
other unhelpful things that people say
Yep.
in light of our loss.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, everything happens for a reason. God will work it all for good.
Yeah.
Doesn't kill you, makes you stronger.
Right.
Yeah. Aren't you glad you have faith? You know everything's going to be fine. So in most, not all of those, there's
Yeah.
a grain of truth, right?
Right.
You
Right.
know, God does work things for good ultimately over time.
Right.
That kind of thing. And I think when people say things like that after loss, oftentimes it comes from a place of wanting to be helpful, wanting to be encouraging.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it also oftentimes comes from a place of being a little uncomfortable with
Yes.
suffering and wanting to stay with positivity, with faith, with certainty. Even when, that's not the reality that's
Right.
in front of them. So I
Yeah.
think it's a little bit of kind of that both and.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and what I and so many experience is when that kind of season of suffering or season of uncertainty sort of lasts for longer than
Yeah.
people think it ought to. If it extends, it often the message starts to become of blame.
Mm.
What have you done to
Yeah.
deserve this, or what have you not done
Mm.
to make it resolve more quickly? And yeah, I think we have to to push back on all of that.
Yeah.
And it goes back to your question. Can you just sit with
Mm-hmm.
me? Don't
Yeah.
fast forward through questions. Stay with them,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and know that, um, well-intentioned though it may be, those things can often uh, deeply wound people.
Mm-hmm.
I know so many people, and my guess is that you do as well, who have been
Yeah.
told that they're somehow responsible for their infertility or their miscarriage,
Mm-hmm.
or that God needed another whomever in
Yeah.
heaven, and that's why
Yeah.
God took
Yeah.
your loved one, and and those things can do real damage to people's
Really.
souls.
Yes,
Hmm.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, I just love, value these conversations to bring more awareness to the language that is used
Mhm.
surrounding loss and grief and pain and suffering, um,
Yes.
to kind of dispel some of the myths, some of the unhelpful things that we hear. Because sometimes what I've found, even in my own life, is that we're just influenced by our culture. We're influenced by the way we grew up. Like, I grew up in church as well, um, and even from a loss and grief pain perspective, I didn't learn many things on how
Mm.
to deal with, to cope with it well. It was more
Yes.
so of keeping the faith, and it's like, what does that mean? Like, what does that look like
Yes.
in practice, practical
Mhm.
things? What do I do, and
Yes.
so a lot of it is still just having grace with people who don't know, but like
Mhm.
people like you and I and others who are writing in this space, to continue to just spread awareness that there
Yes.
are tools, where there are things that we can do practically
Yes.
that we found biblically, like, from the
Mhm.
Bible. So I love this so much. Um,
Mm.
what um, what is some practical advice? I know you have the whole book on the different practices. So maybe what is your favorite one? Maybe that's a better question.
Yeah. So yeah, like you, my chapters end with a lament practice, and they end with two actually. One for kind of individuals to engage, and then one that is child friendly to do in families or in community. And so because again, as we kind of started, the children among us are experiencing loss just like we are, and so honoring that reality it feels important. So my favorite practice to engage myself and to offer with others is just a simple tearing practice. And so I'm not going through and like tearing up all the clothes in my closet, which would be fine, I suppose. But it's so simple, right? You can take just old notes, old magazines, old newspaper, and you allow what you're grieving to surface, and you simply tear as you do. You can do it with cloth. I have I use bandanas sometimes, and so I don't know if you can hear the sounds.
Yeah.
Okay, good. But the sound is a big part of it.
Okay.
And the action of tearing is also. And so what happens is we're echoing these practices that have been modeled for us.
Right.
And it's allowing an expression of the invisible brokenness, the invisible pain. It's allowing it to become visible, and in a way that can be seen and touched and heard. And I'll tell you, when I share this practice with people, I hear a couple of things really consistently. One is they will begin with an expectation of focusing on a particular loss. And that happens sometimes, but oftentimes, because grief is so connected, other experiences of loss that will get surfaced as well and get expressed, in that tearing practice as well, because again, grief is not linear,
right?
And our losses are connected. The other thing I hear really consistently is, and this is again that permission piece, is that they enter an experience like this expecting to feel sad, expecting even to cry, perhaps. What surprises them is there will oftentimes be flashes of anger and other strong emotions as well, that speak to the pain of loss and to the injustice of life, when suffering happens. And there again, that anger was within them, for every one of those people. And until they gave it room to move, they didn't understand that was there too. And there's permission to bring that into God's presence as well, the fullness of the emotions.
Oh my gosh, this is so good. It's so powerful. Just the permission, the expression, because so much, and I don't know if people realize just how much our bodies hold emotion.
Yes.
And if it's not released, then it shows up different places.
That's right. Comes out sideways, doesn't it?
Right. And so this is just so important. Like your book is it is such a gift. It's a gift to the body of Christ. It's a gift to our grieving hearts. Like I absolutely love practical books. I love story, but I what can I do? Like today, like I can take your book and I can start something today that's going to help me. So I'm super excited to share this and to share to put in practice myself and my kiddos. Like, you include stuff for the kids. So I want to ask real quick before we wrap things up. Have you used, like, I know you have the exercises in a way that you can use for your kids. Have you used it for your kids or your grandkids at all?
Well, so my daughter is well
Yeah.
grown and
Yeah.
launched into the world. So
Yeah.
I hadn't written them when she was
Okay.
a
It's
young
true.
one.
Yeah.
And my grandkids are not yet a year old.
Yeah. I got
So
you.
so
Okay.
but I have used them with my godchildren who
Okay.
are a little bit older.
Yeah.
And again, permission and
Mhm.
something embodied, something that honors the whole person for children can be really powerful. The
Yeah.
tearing practice
Yes.
is
Mhm.
can be really freeing for kids, and um, and often we'll have kind of a follow-up activity
Mhm.
that's more of beginning to put pieces back together.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
So. Mhm.
Yeah. Just so beautiful. So
Mhm.
beautiful. I love it so much. Um, so what would you leave with the listeners
Mhm.
um, who are just in a place of loss, and maybe, maybe they have had a succession of losses,
Mhm.
and maybe they don't feel like they have permission to grieve, or permission to really really speak out, especially even in the church, like
Yes.
if they have like some dealings with church hurt or things of the church,
Mhm.
um, and they're just finding a place like they don't, maybe they don't even feel like they belong anymore because maybe they're in transition even.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
what would you say to them?
Mhm. Uh, I would say, um, I would say you do have permission to grieve
Yeah.
and take your time.
Mhm.
Don't rush. um, uh, I would say God has all the room in the world for your questions, for your grief, for your anger, for your confusion. Um, has all the room in the world for all of those things, exactly as you are. And there are brothers and sisters and communities of faith where there is room for those things. And my hope is that you will find your way to them, because we don't want to stay in these places of loss alone. It's so valuable and healing, to have permission to bring them into the light with trustworthy others.
Yes,
Mm.
absolutely. I have so enjoyed our time together. Where can we find you, and where can everyone pick up a copy of your book?
Yes, yes. Thank you so much for this conversation. Gosh, it's such a joy to get to dialogue with you. So they can find me at my website. It's terramcdaniel.com. Terra is spelled Terra, like terracotta pot. um, and my book is available on Amazon, wherever you buy your books.
Mm.
It's there. But and I will say if you want to start reading right away at IVP's website, there's an excerpt available that you can download as a PDF. So I hope you'll
Yay.
welcome, and I'm so excited to share it with you and others.
Thank you so much for sitting with me, Tara.
Thanks for the invitation.
I hope you enjoyed listening to this conversation with Terra McDaniel on sitting with hopeful lament and grief. Find helpful resources from this episode in the description, including my book, Can You Just Sit With Me? Healthy Grieving for the Losses of Life, and Tara's book, Hopeful Lament, Tending Our Grief Through Spiritual Practices. Be sure to share, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you stream. Thanks again for sitting with me.